The fog was so thick that morning I could barely see the road. My son tossed my suitcase beside a rotting cabin deep in the mountains and stared at me with cold eyes. "You've been a burden long enough," he said. "Stay here." Then he drove away without looking back. I stood alone in the freezing silence, wondering how the boy I had raised for 38 years had become a stranger. 3 days later, my phone lit up with the 53rd missed call from him, and when I finally answered, the fear in his voice told me something had gone terribly wrong. I'm truly grateful you're here for this one. Before we dive in, leave me a quick comment. What time of day is it? Where you are right now? Your thoughts in the comments mean more than you know. Quick note, some details have been adjusted for storytelling and reflection. What truly matters is the lesson at the heart of it all. The monitor flatlined at exactly 2 a.m., and I understood that some endings arrive without warning. Gerald's hand was still warm when the sound changed, that steady beep, 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 flattening into one long, unbroken tone that filled the room. I watched the green line go straight, watched it stay straight, watched the numbers drop to 0. A nurse rushed in. Someone touched my shoulder, but I couldn't look away from his face. My husband of 32 years, Gerald Mercer, 64 years old Chief Ranger for the Shenandoah National Forest. For 3 decades, the man who could identify every bird by its call and every tree by its bark. The man who promised me we'd see spring together. Dr. Hendricks appeared a tired-eyed physician who'd been treating Gerald for 6 months without finding answers to his mysterious decline. He checked the monitors, pressed his stethoscope to Gerald's chest, and spoke the words that made it real. "Time of death, 2:03 a.m., Mrs. Mercer. I'm so sorry." My voice came out small and distant. "He said he'd stay until spring. He promised me spring." The nurse squeezed my shoulder gently. "Take all the time you need, Mrs. Mercer." But what time did I need 6 months ago? Gerald had been healthy, strong. We'd hiked the Appalachian Trail section near our home, planned a trip to see the autumn leaves. Then came the fatigue, the tremors, the confusion that would drift across his face like clouds over the sun. The doctors ran tests, blood work scans, biopsies. Nothing conclusive, nothing that explained why a healthy man was simply fading. Yesterday, between morphine doses, Gerald had gripped my hand with surprising strength. His voice was barely a whisper, but his eyes were sharp. "I took care of everything, Alice," he'd said. "You'll understand when the time comes." I'd asked what he meant, but the morphine pulled him back under. Now he'd never answer. Now I sat holding his cooling hand, trying to decode a message I didn't understand. The hospital air conditioning kicked on with a mechanical sigh. I pulled the thin blanket higher over Gerald's chest, as if he might still feel the cold. 2 hours passed in that strange, suspended way. Time moves when the world has ended but keeps spinning. I sat. I held his hand. I watched his face and waited for him to breathe, even though I knew he wouldn't. Then Barrett arrived. My son burst through the ICU doors at 4 a.m., wearing an expensive charcoal suit that smelled of cologne and cocktail parties. His tie was loosened, his face flushed. He'd come straight from some business function. Barrett Mercer, 38 years old, successful investment banker, my only child, the boy I'd raised, the man I barely recognized. "Mom, I came as soon as I got the message." He stopped at the foot of the bed, breathing hard. "How long ago did he—" 2 hours, I said quietly. Barrett looked at his father's body for exactly 3 seconds. Then his eyes shifted to me, to the monitors, to the paperwork on the rolling table. "Did Dad have the will ready?" The question came out rushed, almost reflexive. The lawyer said there were documents he was supposed to sign. The sterile air seemed to crystallize around us. "Your father died 2 hours ago, Barrett." He had the grace to look embarrassed. "I know, Mom. I know, I'm sorry. There are things that need to be handled. Practical things. I'm trying to help." What kind of son asks about paperwork before asking if his mother needs anything? The thought arrived cold and clear. I looked at Barrett, really looked at him, and saw a stranger in an expensive suit checking his watch, calculating. Already 3 steps ahead to funeral arrangements and estate settlements. "I'm fine," I heard myself say, though he hadn't asked. "You should go home. Get some rest." "Are you sure?" He was already moving toward the door, relief evident. "I have an early meeting, but I can cancel if you need." "Go." Barrett paused at the threshold, remembering he should perform some ritual of grief. "I'll handle the funeral arrangements. You just rest Mom. Don't worry about anything." Then he was gone, expensive shoes clicking down the hallway, leaving me alone with the husband he'd barely looked at and the mother he'd never asked about. I sat in the silence he left behind. The air conditioning hummed. The monitor sat dark and quiet. Gerald's hand had gone cold now, the warmth that lingered at 2 a.m. completely faded. "What did you mean you took care of everything?" I whispered to his still face. No answer. Just antiseptic smell and distant monitors beeping in other rooms where other people were still alive. I replayed the moment. Barrett's entrance, his flushed face, his immediate question. Did Dad have the will ready? Not how are you holding up? Not can I get you anything? Not even can I sit with him? Just the will, just the documents, just the inheritance. I told myself it was grief making me suspicious. Standing here now, I know it was recognition. The moment Barrett asked about the will before asking if I was okay, something cold settled in my chest, something that felt like dread and clarity mixed together. I told myself he was just stressed, just overwhelmed, just being practical the way some people are. I told myself I was being unfair, that grief makes us all say the wrong thing. But sitting alone in that sterile room at 5 a.m. with Gerald's hand growing colder in mine, and the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and my son's cologne still lingering in the air, I couldn't shake the feeling that Barrett had been waiting for this moment. That somewhere in the 6 months of Gerald's mysterious decline in the unexplained tremors, and the tests that found nothing, and the steady fading of a healthy man my son had been preparing. For what I didn't yet know, but 2 weeks later at the funeral, I would see exactly how carefully he had been planning. 2 weeks after Gerald's death, my son hugged me at the funeral and whispered that he'd take care of everything. He played the devoted son flawlessly. Barrett stood at the funeral home in mid-November, delivering a eulogy that brought tears to every eye. He spoke of his father's love for the forest, his dedication to family, his quiet wisdom. He wiped his eyes. He embraced relatives. He held my hand and told everyone he wouldn't let his mother face this grief alone. I wanted to believe him. Some part of me still wanted to believe this was my son and not the stranger who'd asked about the will before asking if I was okay. Beside him stood Celeste Cross Mercer, 35 years old, in a designer black dress that probably cost more than Gerald's entire funeral. Barrett's wife had always been beautiful in that sharp, polished way that made me feel like a rumpled country schoolteacher. Her blonde hair pulled back in a perfect chignon. Her makeup flawless. Her smile, when offered to mourners, never quite reached her cold, calculating eyes. "Mom, you can't live alone anymore," Barrett said after the service, holding both my hands. "Come stay with us. Let me take care of you the way Dad would have wanted." The house in Charlottesville felt too empty without Gerald, so I said yes. I packed 2 suitcases and let my son drive me to his mansion in Richmond. Celeste gave me a tour with a practiced smile. The house was massive 3 floors, marble counters, original art. She walked me past 5 empty guest rooms with king beds and ensuite bathrooms before stopping at a door at the very end of a dim hallway. "I hope this will be comfortable enough," she said, opening it to reveal a room barely larger than a closet. Single bed, 1 window facing the neighbor's brick wall. "It's all we have available right now." I noticed the door had no lock on the inside. That first week, Celeste was everywhere. She appeared in my room to help me unpack, going through my suitcases with hands that lingered too long on Gerald's old geological journal, the flip phone Barrett had given me, my jewelry. "I just need to make sure you have everything you need," Alice, she said, her fingers sorting through my things like cataloging inventory. 6 weeks passed in a blur of grief and sedatives Barrett's doctor had prescribed. December rain pelted the windows. I moved through the mansion like a ghost, trying to stay small, trying not to be a burden. One evening in late December, Barrett appeared with a flip phone in a box. "Mom, keep this for emergencies," he said, pressing it into my hands. "Your smartphone is too complicated when you're upset. This one just makes calls. Simple. He took my iPhone and pocketed it before I could protest. My hands were shaking. They'd been shaking since the funeral, since the sedatives, since everything. Then he brought out papers, official-looking documents with tiny print that swam before my eyes. "This is just to protect your assets for 1 year," Barrett explained, his voice so reasonable. "Temporary legal protection for the Sycamore Ridge land, estate tax purposes. Sign here and here." My vision blurred with tears and grief and whatever pills the doctor had given me. The overhead light made everything too bright. I could barely read the heading, something about medical provisions and body donation. "I trust you, son," I heard myself say. "You know I've never understood these legal things. When did I become the kind of woman who signed papers without reading them?" I signed where Barrett pointed. He took the top page, the one I'd actually signed, and handed me the remaining documents. "These are your copies. Keep them safe." Later, organizing my belongings in that small room, I tucked the unsigned land deed, papers into Gerald's old geological journal, the one Celeste had been so interested in. The leather was worn soft from years of Gerald's handling. It smelled like him. I kept it under my pillow. January came with ice storms that made the mansion creak. I lay awake most nights in that small room, listening to the wind and thinking about Gerald's cryptic words. What had he taken care of? Then late one January night, I heard Barrett's voice through the thin wall separating my room from his office. He was on the phone and he sounded desperate. "Just 30 more days, the land sale will cover everything, I promise." A pause. "I know what I said last quarter. I know. But the land is worth $12 million. Once my mother signs the deed transfer, yes, I know she already signed. There was a complication with the notary. We're handling it." My heart stopped. 30 days, Barrett said again. "That's all I'm asking. Don't call the loans, please." The office door opened and closed, Celeste's voice sharp and clear through the wall. "Did they agree?" "Barely," Barrett said. "We're out of time. She needs to sign the actual deed. The body donation form isn't going to save us." "Then we make her sign." "She's stubborn. She doesn't understand the documents. She keeps putting them away." "The land is our only way out," Celeste said, and I could hear the cold calculation in her voice. "If she won't sign willingly, we'll make her want to leave." I lay perfectly still in the darkness, barely breathing. Barrett's office light clicked off. Footsteps retreated down the hallway. The mansion settled into silence. I made a silent decision I would not let fear make me weak. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to ice hit the windows, thinking about my son discussing how to force me out. The small room felt smaller, the walls closer. But somewhere beneath the fear, something else was taking shape, the same steel that had managed 32 years of classrooms full of children who thought they could get away with things. Gerald hadn't married a weak woman. And whatever was coming, I would face it on my feet. The campaign to break me would begin with breakfast. The morning after I overheard their plan, Celeste looked at my cardigan across the breakfast table and smiled. Winter sunlight poured through the mansion windows, harsh and cold. Early February in Richmond, the kind of light that shows every flaw, every worn thread, every sign of age. Celeste sat across from me in a cream cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my monthly pension. Her coffee was in bone china. Mine was in a chipped mug that had appeared at my place setting sometime in the last week. Barrett sat at the head of the table reading the financial section of the newspaper like it was the most fascinating thing in the world. "That cardigan is older than our marriage, Alice," Celeste said, reaching for the butter. Her voice was pleasant, conversational, like she was commenting on the weather. "We don't do paper napkins here." She removed the paper napkin I'd placed in my lap and replaced it with cloth. Her fingers were cool and deliberate. I said nothing. I'd learned in 32 years of teaching that sometimes silence is the strongest response. "Barrett's mother has such quaint expressions." Celeste continued looking at her husband. "It's charming, really. Very rural." Barrett turned a page, said nothing. I smiled and sipped my coffee. But under the table, my hands were shaking, not from weakness, but from the effort of keeping them still. This wasn't anger. I'd seen anger. This was something else. This was a rehearsed script performed with the precision of someone who'd done this before. Every word calculated, every pause deliberate. Celeste was systematically dismantling my dignity, one breakfast at a time, and Barrett was letting her. No, Barrett was participating through his silence. "I think I'll take my breakfast in my room tomorrow," I said quietly. "Nonsense," Celeste said. "We're family. Family eats together." The word family tasted like poison in that bright, cold room. How many breakfasts like this could one person endure before something inside them simply broke? 1 week later, on a Friday evening in mid-February, I found out exactly how far Celeste was willing to take this. Barrett was hosting a dinner party. 6 of his business partners seated around a table beneath crystal chandeliers that threw light like diamonds. The smell of roasted duck and expensive wine. Celeste had seated me at the far end between 2 men who talked over me about market volatility. Midway through the main course, Celeste launched into what she called a hilarious story about how I'd confused the dishwasher settings and flooded the kitchen. The table laughed. I hadn't confused anything. I'd been doing dishes by hand because I didn't want to be a burden. But Celeste told it beautifully, timed the punchline perfectly, made everyone laugh at the confused old woman who couldn't work modern appliances. Then Mr. Caldwell, a polite business associate in his 50s, seated to my right, turned to me with genuine interest. "Mrs. Mercer, what did you do before you retired?" I opened my mouth to answer. "Oh, Alice was just a small-town schoolteacher," Celeste cut in smoothly. "Nothing exciting. My mother sat on 3 nonprofit boards and raised money for the Richmond Symphony. She was quite accomplished." The word accomplished hung in the air like a judgment. The implication was clear I was not. Something inside me that had been bending for weeks finally snapped. I set my wine glass down very gently, looked Celeste directly in the eye. "Your mother sounds remarkable," I said. My voice was perfectly calm, perfectly pleasant. "Tell me, does she know her son-in-law's company is being audited for financial irregularities?" The silence that fell over that table was absolute. Crystal clinked against china. Someone's fork hit their plate. Mr. Caldwell cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should discuss the weather," he said uncomfortably. Barrett's face had gone very still. Celeste's smile had frozen in place, no longer reaching her eyes, though it never had. "I think," Celeste said slowly, "that Alice might be tired. The evenings can be confusing." But the damage was done. The guests knew I wasn't confused. The guests knew I'd just lobbed a grenade into the middle of their polite dinner party. The evening ended early. Awkward farewells in the foyer, coats retrieved too quickly, promises to get together soon that everyone knew were lies. I sat in my small room afterwards, staring at the wall, replaying the moment. The look on Celeste's face, the silence at the table, the small vicious satisfaction of watching her careful facade crack. But satisfaction faded quickly, because I knew what came next. The knock on my door came at 11 p.m. Barrett stood in the hallway still in his dinner clothes. His face was expressionless, but his voice, when he spoke, was very quiet. That was worse than shouting. I'd learned that, as a mother, Barrett's quiet voice was the dangerous one. "Mom," he said, "you need to understand your position in this house." "I understand perfectly," I said. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded once and walked away, his footsteps fading down the hallway. I closed the door, sat on the edge of my narrow bed, stared at the wall where I could hear Barrett's office on the other side, where I'd heard him beg for 30 more days, where I'd heard Celeste plan to make me want to leave. I sat in that small room and realized this was no longer about signing papers. This was about survival. I had just escalated a war I couldn't win by force. I had no money of my own. Barrett had taken my iPhone and given me a flip phone. No car. Barrett drove me everywhere. No friends in Richmond. Everyone I knew was back in Charlottesville. No leverage except one thing: I hadn't signed that land deed. But I'd shown my hand tonight. I'd revealed that I knew about the audit, about the financial crisis. I'd made myself dangerous. And dangerous things I knew from 32 years of managing children who thought they could get away with anything get dealt with. I began to think very carefully about what a woman with 3 decades of classroom discipline and nothing left to lose might actually be capable of. 10 days later, a phone would ring in a garden I'd forgotten existed. 10 days after the dinner party, a phone I'd forgotten existed rang at 6 in the morning. I'd been lying awake in my small room watching winter dawn creep across the ceiling. The house was silent. Barrett and Celeste wouldn't be awake for another 2 hours. I'd learned their patterns when they slept, when they ate, when they left me alone. Then faint through the window, I heard it. An old-fashioned ring. Not the electronic chirp of modern phones, but the mechanical trill of a landline from another era. I pulled on my cardigan, the one Celeste hated, and slipped downstairs. The back door was unlocked. Frost clung to the garden grass, turning everything silver in the pre-dawn light. My breath came out in clouds. The sound was coming from the old garden pavilion, a decorative structure Barrett used for exactly nothing. Inside, on a dusty table, sat a phone I'd completely forgotten. An actual landline with a cord installed years ago when Barrett first bought the mansion. It rang insistently. I picked it up. "Alice," a voice said, deep and familiar, though I couldn't place it at first. "It's Graham Prescott. I know you don't have your cell phone. Gerald told me to use this line if anything ever happened to him." Graham Prescott, Gerald's friend for 40 years, 63 years old with weathered hands and a voice that sounded like safety. "Graham," I said quietly, "how did you—" "I don't have much time," he interrupted. His voice was urgent but controlled. "Listen carefully. Don't sign anything else. Keep Gerald's journal, the one with the leather cover. Keep the backup phone Barrett gave you. And keep them both hidden." My heart was pounding. "Why, Gerald left you something important at Sycamore Ridge," Graham said. "I'll explain everything when the time is right. For now, just trust me. Can you do that?" "Yes," I whispered. "Good, I'll be in touch." The line went dead. I stood in that freezing pavilion holding a silent phone, watching my breath fog the morning air. Gerald had arranged this. 9 months before he died, maybe longer, my quiet, methodical husband had set up a safety net I didn't know existed. Gerald had known. My quiet, methodical husband had somehow seen all of this coming, and he had not left me without a way through. I walked back to the house as the sun rose, tucked the knowledge away like a weapon I'd been given, but didn't yet know how to use. 3 days later, I learned exactly who was hunting my son. It was a rare sunny afternoon in late February. I'd been in my room reading when I heard the doorbell. Voices in the foyer below. I moved to the hallway, staying back from the banister where I could see down to the entrance without being seen. A man in a cold gray suit stood facing Barrett. He was 58, maybe 60, with silver hair combed back from a face that showed no warmth. His voice wasn't loud, but every word cut like a razor. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "your balance with Cross Financial is now $1.8 million. Mr. Cross is not a patient man." Barrett's face had gone pale. "I just need a little more time. The land sale will cover everything." "The land sale you mentioned 3 months ago," the man said, "the one that was supposed to close in January. There were complications. Mr. Cross doesn't accept complications. He accepts payment." I gripped the banister. $1.8 million. Barrett owed someone nearly $2 million. But it was the name that stopped my breath. Cross. Cross Financial. Celeste Cross Mercer. The creditor and the wife sharing a name. I watched Barrett's shoulders slump. Watched him nod and promise and beg for just a little more time. Watched the man in the gray suit turn to leave with the absolute confidence of someone who held all the cards. Then Celeste appeared. She came through the side door from the kitchen, elegant in a burgundy sweater, her hair perfect as always. She stopped when she saw the man in the gray suit. For just a moment, no more than 2 seconds, their eyes met. It wasn't the look of strangers. It was recognition, brief but unmistakable. "Mr. Cross." Celeste said, her voice carefully casual. "Always a pleasure." "Mrs. Mercer," he replied. His tone was perfectly neutral. Then he was gone. The door closed. Barrett stood in the foyer looking defeated. Celeste touched his shoulder and said something too quiet for me to hear. I slipped back to my room, silently sat on the edge of my narrow bed, and turned the name over in my mind. Cross. Celeste Cross Mercer. Maiden name Cross. The predatory creditor collecting debts from her husband shared her maiden name. It might be coincidence, a common surname, distant relatives, pure chance. In 32 years of teaching, I had learned that very few things involving money were ever coincidences. I thought about the glance they'd exchanged, the careful casualness of Celeste's greeting, the way she'd appeared exactly when the creditor was leaving, as if she'd been waiting nearby, as if she'd known he was coming. Barrett was desperate. That much was clear. He needed the Sycamore Ridge land to cover nearly $2 million in debt. He'd moved me into his house, isolated me, tried to get me to sign papers I didn't understand. But what if Barrett wasn't the architect of this trap? What if my son, with all his callousness and his cold calculation about inheritance, was also a victim? What if someone else had set this entire machine in motion and Barrett was just a piece being moved across the board? I stood and walked to the window, looked out at the neighbor's brick wall that was my only view. That night I could not sleep. Instead, I opened Gerald's journal for the first time. And if this wasn't coincidence, if Celeste and this predator were connected, then Barrett wasn't just desperate. He was being hunted, and I might be feeling sorry for the wrong person. 1 week after discovering the connection between Celeste and the creditor, I finally opened Gerald's journal. I'd been afraid to look at it. The leather cover was worn soft from years of his handling, and just touching it made my chest ache. But Graham had told me to keep it safe, and I needed to understand why. It was late February, another rainy night. Soft rain tapped against my small window like fingers asking to be let in. I sat under the reading lamp, the only furniture in the room besides the narrow bed and a single chair, and carefully opened to the first page. Gerald's handwriting. Perfectly straight lines, each letter formed with the precision of a man who'd spent 40 years documenting forest surveys. Seeing it again after months made something crack in my chest, but it was the words that stopped my breath. Sycamore Ridge Survey begun January 2022. Initial mineral findings exceed all expectations. Preliminary samples indicate rare earth deposits of significant commercial value. Further analysis required. Keep this safe, Alice, keep this safe. I traced the words with trembling fingers. January 2022. Gerald had started this survey 10 months before he died. He'd known something massive about that land, the land Barrett wanted so desperately, the land Celeste kept mentioning, the land I'd unknowingly refused to sign over. The worthless mountain property wasn't worthless at all. I flipped through more pages. Technical notations I didn't fully understand. Geological terms, mineral compositions. But the meaning was clear enough. Gerald had found something valuable, something worth far more than anyone realized. You knew, I whispered to the empty room. All along you knew. My husband had seen all of this coming, had spent his final months preparing for a future I was only now beginning to understand. I thought about Gerald's mysterious decline, the unexplained symptoms, the tests that found nothing, the way he'd gripped my hand in the hospital and whispered that he'd taken care of everything. What if it wasn't mysterious at all? The thought arrived cold and clear, and I pushed it away because I wasn't ready to face what it meant. Not yet. I was turning to the next page when I heard Celeste's voice through the thin wall. She was in Barrett's office, the room that shared a wall with mine. Her voice was clear and cold, cutting through plaster and wallpaper like a knife. "We've wasted enough time being gentle," she said. "Either she signs next week or we move to Plan B." I froze the journal still open in my lap. Barrett's voice came next, uncertain in a way I'd never heard from my confident son. "What's Plan B?" Then silence. Long, deliberate silence. I held my breath, waiting for Celeste to answer, waiting for her to explain what Plan B meant, what horrors those two simple words contained. But she said nothing. The silence stretched. 5 seconds, 10, 20. That silence spoke louder than any threat could. Footsteps crossed the office floor. A door opened and closed. The voices faded. I sat perfectly still in my small room, holding Gerald's journal against my chest, listening to the rain tap against the window. Plan B. I didn't know exactly what those two words meant, but that calculating, deliberate silence when Barrett asked, that told me everything I needed to know. Next week. Celeste had given a timeline, 7 days before they stopped being gentle and moved to whatever Plan B entailed. What kind of Plan B required that long, cold silence before it could even be spoken aloud? I thought about Gerald's mysterious illness, about Barrett's desperate need for the land, about Vincent Cross and his cold gray suit and the way he'd looked at Celeste like they shared secrets Barrett didn't know, about the body donation form I'd signed thinking it was land deed paperwork, about the flip phone Barrett had given me and the way Celeste searched through my belongings, about the breakfast humiliations and the dinner party disaster and the small room with no lock at the end of the hallway. About Gerald's perfectly straight handwriting, mineral findings exceed all expectations. Pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite see. I closed the journal, carefully pressing it against my chest. My heart was pounding. Outside, the rain continued its patient tapping like time counting down. 7 days. Whatever Plan B meant, I had 7 days before it began. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkness. Somewhere in the house below, Barrett and Celeste were making plans. Somewhere in Richmond, Vincent Cross was calculating interest on nearly $2 million in debt. Somewhere in the mountains, Sycamore Ridge sat with its rare earth deposits and its secrets. And somewhere in the past, Gerald had seen all of this coming and tried to prepare me. Keep this safe, Alice. I tucked the journal beneath my pillow like a talisman, like a weapon I'd been given but didn't yet know how to use. Graham had told me Gerald left something important at Sycamore Ridge. Now I understood the land itself was what he'd left me. Not just property, not just a mountain, but a fortune that Barrett desperately needed and Celeste was willing to do anything to get. Plan B. I lay down in the darkness, still fully dressed, listening to the house settle around me. Sleep didn't come. Instead, I stared at the ceiling, watching shadows from the window shift and change as car headlights passed on the street below. Gerald left me the journal for a reason. I just had to survive long enough to understand why. 7 days. Next week, Celeste had said. Either I signed or they moved to Plan B. 7 days. That was all I had. And I had no idea if it would be enough. 3 days later, on a Tuesday morning, my son would tell me to pack a bag. 3 days after I heard them discuss Plan B, my son stood by the kitchen window and told me to pack a bag. It was Tuesday morning in early March. Gray light filtered through the mansion windows. Barrett stood near the glass with his back to me, shoulders rigid, hands in his pockets. "Mom, pack your essentials," he said without turning around. "Just the essentials. We're going for a drive." My coffee cup stopped halfway to my lips. "Where are we going, Barrett?" Silence. Then, as I stood to go upstairs, he added flatly, "Leave your phone on the kitchen counter." Not a request, a command. I set my smartphone on the granite counter like he asked. But upstairs, packing slowly and deliberately in my small room, I made different choices. Gerald's leather journal went into my suitcase wrapped in a cardigan. The flip phone Barrett had given me months ago, the one he'd forgotten about, the one he thought was just for emergencies, I buried that deep beneath clothing layers at the very bottom where casual inspection wouldn't find it. A photograph of Gerald and me on our wedding day. His old compass, the brass one he'd carried for 40 years of forest surveys. I packed like a woman who knew she might not be coming back. Some part of me, the part that had spent 32 years preparing lesson plans and emergency drills and worst-case scenarios for classrooms full of children, understood that Plan B had arrived. 2 hours later, I sat in the passenger seat of Barrett's SUV, watching Richmond fade in the rearview mirror. We headed west on Interstate 64. Fog blanketed the distant ridges. Barrett's hands gripped the steering wheel at 10 and 2 with mechanical precision. The silence between us was absolute. I watched the mile markers, memorized every road sign out of habit I couldn't break. Staunton exit, Waynesboro. The state routes getting smaller and smaller numbers I'd never heard of. Barrett's son, I said softly as we passed another fog-shrouded valley. Whatever this is, we can talk about it. His hands tightened on the wheel. That was his only response. I fell silent, continued memorizing every turn. I memorized every turn because the part of me that had spent decades planning for the unexpected already knew I would need to find my way back. The cell service bars on the dashboard display disappeared after we passed a green sign, Augusta County, 12 miles. Then the paved road ended. Gravel crackled under the tires loud in the silence. Then dirt. The SUV bounced over ruts and rocks. Through the fog, dark pines closed in on both sides like walls. We climbed for another 20 minutes on a road that was barely a road. Just 2 tire tracks through wilderness. Then Barrett stopped. Through the fog ahead, I could see the outline of something that hadn't been lived in for years, maybe decades. A structure with broken windows, sagging porch, wood rotting at the corners. The whole thing tilted slightly to the left, like it was too tired to stand up straight. Barrett got out without a word, walked to the back of the SUV, opened the hatch. I heard my suitcase hit the frozen ground like garbage being thrown out. I opened my door slowly. The cold hit me immediately, that bone-deep March cold that comes off mountain fog. "Barrett," he cut me off. "You've been a burden long enough," he said. The words came out like he'd been rehearsing them, like Celeste had written the script and he'd memorized his lines. "Celeste builds things," he continued, his voice rising. "Creates real value. What have you done except take up space and remind me of a life I'm trying to move past?" I stood there in the freezing fog looking at my son, seeing a stranger wearing Barrett's face. "Your whole generation," he said, and his voice cracked. "You just take and expect everyone else to carry you. Dad's gone. This is all that's left of what he gave you." He gestured at the rotting shack. "Stay here," Barrett said. His voice broke on the final words. "This is Gerald's land. Go haunt it with him." Then he was back in the SUV, engine roaring to life. Tires spinning in the mud before finding purchase. I stood beside my suitcase on frozen ground, watching red taillights disappear into fog. The sound of the engine faded, gone. Nothing left but wind through dying pines and my own breathing. I looked down at my hands. They were shaking, not from cold, not yet. From the suitcase, I pulled out Gerald's compass. The brass was cold against my palm. I held it the way he used to hold it, letting it settle and find north. Standing there in the wilderness my son had abandoned me to, I heard Gerald's voice in my memory as clearly as if he stood beside me. "Alice," he used to say when I worried about things beyond my control, "when everything is taken from you, that's when you find out what you're actually made of." I looked at the broken shelter ahead of me, walls that wouldn't keep out wind, windows that wouldn't keep out cold, a porch that looked like it would collapse under any weight. Behind me, the tire tracks were already filling with fog. Ahead of me, a structure that might kill me just by existing. In my pocket, a flip phone Barrett didn't know about. In my suitcase, a journal revealing that this worthless land was worth millions. And in my chest, something that felt like it should be grief, but was hardening into something else entirely. Gerald had always said I was tougher than I thought. Standing there holding his compass with my son's dust still settling in the air, I decided it was time to prove him right. "All right, Gerald," I said to the empty air. "Let's find out." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and approaching night. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called. The temperature was dropping. I picked up my suitcase and walked toward the shack. That first night, the temperature would drop to 33 degrees. And I had 7 tries to make fire before my hands stopped working. The shack offered almost no protection. Wind howled through broken windows and gaps in the rotting walls. I could see my breath in the fading light. My fingers were already numb. I opened Gerald's journal with shaking hands, expecting geological surveys and mineral notes. Instead, the first section was something else entirely, a camping guide written in Gerald's precise handwriting. How to start fire with flint and steel. How to locate water by following animal tracks. How to determine wind direction with a wet finger and patience. It was as if he'd known, as if he'd prepared this exact thing years ago, knowing I might someday need it. Start with the smallest kindling, he'd written. Patient hands beat desperate ones. I gathered what I could find in the debris, old newspapers, splinters of dry wood from broken furniture, pine needles blown in through the gaps. My hands shook from cold and shock, but I forced them steady. First try, no spark. Second try, spark died instantly. Third, fourth, fifth, nothing but frustration and darkening sky. By the 6th try, I couldn't feel my fingertips anymore. The cold was moving deeper into my bones, into the places where giving up starts to feel reasonable. 7th try. The spark caught. Tiny flame in a nest of pine needles and newspaper. I cupped my hands around it, feeding it carefully, smallest kindling first, just like Gerald said. The flame grew, spread to larger pieces, became something that could keep me alive. "Thank you, Gerald," I whispered to the empty room. "Thank you." I sat by that small fire, feeding it through the night, and read further into the journal. By midnight, I had fire shelter I had patched with cardboard from the debris, and Gerald's words for company. Cold alone, furious but alive. And alive, I decided somewhere between the 3rd and 4th hour was enough for now. By flickering firelight, I turned past the survival section into Gerald's geological survey notes. The handwriting was the same, but the content shifted. Technical, precise. Survey Section 3, underground acoustic signatures consistent with significant mineral deposit. I read the line 3 times before it registered. Initial findings exceed all expectations. Further analysis required. Preliminary samples sent to independent lab January 2022. Results pending. Mineral deposit. Gerald had found something here. Something valuable enough to document carefully. Something Barrett had never known about when he'd driven me up this mountain and abandoned me. I kept reading through exhaustion, trying to understand. Why had Gerald surveyed this land so carefully? Why had he kept it secret? Why had he written a survival guide in the front of a geological journal unless he'd anticipated exactly this scenario? Outside, something moved in the darkness, louder than wind. Animals, maybe. I didn't know what lived in these mountains. Didn't know if I should be afraid. I fed the fire and kept reading. I didn't sleep that night, but I didn't cry either. By dawn, the despair that had threatened to drown me had shifted into something harder, something that tasted like curiosity mixed with rage. Gerald had left me clues. I just had to survive long enough to understand them. The morning of the 3rd day arrived with frost that didn't thaw until late under gray skies. I'd learned to keep the fire going, learned which wood burned longest, learned that the stream 50 yards downhill ran clear and cold and drinkable. I was foraging for wild berries near the tree line, something else Gerald's guide had taught me, when the flip phone in my inner coat pocket rang. I pulled it out with berry-stained fingers. The screen showed 53 missed calls, all from the same number, Barrett. I stood there in the woods looking at the number, feeling nothing. Then I pressed answer. "Mom." Barrett's voice exploded from the speaker, raw and panicked. "Where have you been? I've been calling for 2 days." I said nothing. "The notary office says there's no executed deed." He said, words tumbling over each other. "The transfer was never signed. You have to come back right now and sign the real papers. Do you understand? You have to—" "No," I said quietly. Silence on the other end. Then, "They're going to break my hands, Mom. Do you understand what I'm saying? Vincent Cross doesn't make threats. He makes examples. I need that land sale or I'm—" "Barrett," I interrupted. My voice was very calm, very cold. "You left me here to die." That's not. I just needed you to understand." I looked up at the pine canopy above me, branches swaying in wind that carried the scent of coming rain, birds calling to each other in a language I was learning to hear. "You threw my suitcase on the ground like garbage," I continued. "You told me to haunt this place with Gerald. You drove away without looking back." "Mom, please." I survived Barrett. 3 nights in freezing temperatures with a shack that has no walls and no heat. I survived anyway. "I'll come get you, right now. We can figure this out together." "No," I said again. Then I hung up, stood there in the woods with the phone in my hand, listening to my own breathing. 53 calls. He had driven me into the mountains to disappear and called me 53 times when he discovered he needed something. I held the phone against my chest and felt something settle into place, cold and clear, and very, very calm. The phone rang again immediately. I didn't answer. Let it ring until it stopped, then tucked it back into my inner coat pocket close to my chest where I could feel it if it rang again. Let him call, let him wonder. I had work to do. Gerald's journal spoke of mineral deposits and acoustic signatures. of findings that exceeded expectations. The land Barrett had tried to steal wasn't worthless. It was exactly the opposite. And I still owned it. The notary office had confirmed it. The deed transfer was never executed. Whatever document I'd signed in my grief-stricken haze wasn't the real thing. The land was still mine. I walked back toward the shack, berry-stained fingers and all feeling something like purpose beginning to take root. That afternoon, familiar footsteps would echo from the tree line. That afternoon, footsteps I half recognized echoed from the tree line behind the shack. I stood from where I'd been crouched by the stream berries forgotten in my hand. Late sun filtered through yellow pine needles, turning everything amber. The footsteps were deliberate, not trying to hide. Not Barrett, I would have heard an engine. A tall man emerged from the trees wearing a faded ranger jacket and baseball cap. Weathered hands, kind eyes. The face I'd never seen, but the voice I'd heard through a garden phone 2 weeks ago. Graham Prescott. I've been watching the road since Barrett's car came through yesterday. He said, entirely unsurprised to find me here. I knew he'd bring you here. I just stared at him, standing there with wild berries in my palm and 3 days of survival written all over me. Gerald called me 9 months before he died. Graham continued quietly. He said, Graham, if something happens to me, make sure Alice gets to Sycamore Ridge. She'll know what to do when she gets there. Something inside me broke. I sat down hard on the wooden steps of the shack, the steps I'd been avoiding, because I wasn't sure they'd hold my weight, and for the first time since Barrett abandoned me, I truly cried. Not the silent tears of the first night, not the exhausted numbness of the second. This was grief releasing into something that felt like gratitude, like relief. Like I wasn't alone anymore in understanding what Gerald had done. He knew, I said through tears. All along he knew. Graham sat down beside me on the questionable steps. They creaked but held. Yes, he said simply. He knew. Gerald had thought of me even at the very end, had reached forward through time and placed this man here today in this exact moment. I didn't know yet what was waiting at this place, but I was no longer alone in not knowing. Evening came with the smell of wood smoke and the sound of fire crackling. Graham stayed helping me patch more of the shack's walls with debris and cardboard. We sat by the fire I'd learned to keep alive, and he told me the rest. Gerald spent 3 years surveying this ridge. Graham said, watching flames dance across rotting floorboards. He found a massive mineral deposit but kept it completely secret. 3 years. I looked at him. He started before he got sick. Long before. He knew what he'd found almost from the beginning, but he never told anyone except me. Why, Graham was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. He said Barrett had his grandfather's relationship with money. It consumed him. Gerald watched it happen over years, watched Barrett marry a woman who made it worse, watched the debt pile up while Barrett kept spending like it didn't exist. I thought about Celeste's designer clothes, the mansion in Richmond, the dinner parties with crystal and imported wine, while Barrett's company collapsed under him. Gerald refused to leave a fortune within Barrett's reach. Graham continued, not until you were strong enough to stand on your own 2 feet. He was protecting me, I whispered, even from our own son. Especially from your own son. We sat in silence watching the fire. Outside, nightbirds called to each other. Inside, I tried to process what Graham was telling me. The land Barrett had thought worthless, the land he'd driven me into the mountains to abandon. So I'd eventually sign over in desperation, held wealth beyond imagination. And Gerald had known, had spent 3 years documenting it, had kept it secret through his entire illness, had arranged for Graham to be here now when I needed him most. How much, I asked finally. Graham looked at me. The preliminary estimate's $12 million in rare earth minerals, maybe more with the right extraction contracts. $12 million. Barrett owed less than $2 million. Gerald could have saved him with a fraction of what this land held, but he'd chosen not to, chosen to let Barrett sink under his own choices while preparing this safety net for me instead. He loved Barrett, Graham said, reading my face. But he loved you more. And he knew Barrett would burn through any fortune handed to him. This way. He gestured at the shack, the fire, the wilderness around us. This way you'd have something that couldn't be taken. Graham reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small old key, brass worn smooth by time. He held it out to me. "For the steel box," he said. "You'll find it when you find the shelter." I took the key slowly. "A shelter here. Gerald built more than you know," Graham said, "and he trusted me to make sure you found it all." The key was heavy in my palm, warm from being in Graham's pocket. I closed my fingers around it, feeling its weight. "Where is it?" I asked. "That," Graham said with something that might have been a smile. "You'll have to figure out yourself." Gerald was very specific about that. He said you'd know it when you found it, that you'd earned the right to discover it on your own terms. I held the key up to the firelight. It was old, well made, the kind of key that opened something built to last. "What's in the box?" "Everything you need," Graham said. "Everything Gerald wanted you to have when you were ready." He stood brushing ash from his jacket. "I'll come back tomorrow," he said. "Bring you some supplies, real food, not just berries and stream water, but I think you're doing pretty well on your own." He paused at the door. "He believed in you, you know. Even at the end, when he could barely speak, he told me, 'Alice is tougher than anyone thinks. She just needs to remember it.' I think you're starting to." Then he was gone, footsteps fading into the darkness. I sat by the fire holding the key, turning it over in my fingers. A hidden shelter, a steel box, a key that fit nothing I could yet see. Gerald had built me a lifeboat before the ship went down and trusted Graham to put me on it. All I had to do was find the door. But first I needed to learn how to survive in a place that was trying very hard to kill me. On the fourth morning, Graham led me down a dirt road to a place I'd never heard of called Millhaven. The walk was 3 miles through woods that smelled like pine sap and damp earth. My legs ached from 10 days of survival, but the movement felt good, purposeful. Millhaven wasn't much. A weathered general store with peeling paint, a small wooden church with a crooked steeple, maybe a dozen houses scattered among the trees. Smoke rose from wood stoves into gray March sky. A bell chimed as I pushed open the store door. Iris Townsend, 64, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and kind eyes that had seen their share of hardship, stood behind the counter. She looked at me with cautious curiosity rather than immediate welcome. I must have looked terrible. 10 days without a shower, clothes wrinkled and stained, hair I hadn't bothered to brush, probably smelling like wood smoke and desperation. But her smile when it came was genuine, even if guarded. "Well, hello there," she said. "I don't think I've seen you around here before." "I'm Alice Mercer," I said. "I'm staying in the old house up the road." Her expression shifted from curiosity to concern. Hugh Townsend, 66, with calloused hands from a lifetime of honest work, emerged from the back room, wiping his hands on an apron. "The old place," Iris said, worry creeping into her voice. "Honey, nobody's lived there in years. That building's not safe." "I'm making it work," I said quietly. Graham stepped up beside me. "She's Gerald Mercer's wife. The land is hers." Something shifted in Iris's face. Recognition, maybe, or understanding that there was more to the story than she'd heard. Before anyone could ask more questions, a small voice interrupted. "I hate math." A girl maybe 8 years old with her mother's silver blonde hair sat at a small table near the window. Homework spread out in front of her. Tears streaked down her face. A pencil lay abandoned beside a worksheet covered in eraser marks. Every instinct I'd honed over 32 years kicked in. I walked over without asking permission, sat down in the chair across from her. "What's the problem?" I asked gently. She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "Fractions. I don't understand them." I looked at the worksheet, division of fractions, the kind of problem that feels impossible until someone shows you the trick. "Let's look at this together," I said. "Sometimes the answer is easier than we think." I walked her through it patiently, showed her how to flip the second fraction and multiply, drew pictures to make it make sense, watched her face shift from frustration to comprehension. "Oh," she said softly. "Oh, I get it." Her tears dried. She picked up the pencil and started working through the problems on her own. That evening, little Clara showed her mother the math problem she had finally understood. Her mother looked at me with something in her eyes I hadn't seen directed at me in months, simple, uncomplicated respect. 2 words: thank you. They rebuilt something in me that a very long car ride had tried to flatten. Iris packed groceries into a canvas bag: bread, canned soup, coffee, real food. "You take these," she said firmly, "and don't you dare try to pay me. It's what neighbors do." Hugh came out from the back carrying a toolbox. "If you need tools for fixing that place up," he said, "I've got extras you can borrow. No rush on returning them." I stood there holding the groceries, feeling something crack in my chest. Not breaking, opening. These people didn't know about the land value, didn't know about Barrett or Celeste or mansions in Richmond. They saw a woman who'd helped a child with homework and decided that was enough. I'd spent months being useful only for what I owned. Here I was valued for who I was. The walk back to the shack felt lighter. Night of the 10th day arrived with the smell of wood smoke and the sound of wind through pines. The shack was warmer now. I'd patched the worst gaps, learned which corners held heat best, made it something close to livable. For the first time since Barrett had abandoned me, the place felt peaceful. I sat by candlelight reading Gerald's journal. I'd been avoiding the geological survey pages, focusing on the survival guide. But tonight I was ready. The 3rd page held precise technical notes: GPS coordinates, mineral compositions, survey markers. And below that, a hand-drawn map. The bunker was marked clearly. Behind the shack, past the blackberry brambles, 15 paces northeast from the lightning-struck oak. But it was what came after the map that made my breath catch. Gerald's handwriting grew smaller, more intimate. The technical precision giving way to something personal. "Alice, if you're reading this alone, it means something went wrong." I traced the words with my finger. "The box has everything you need. Trust Graham, and trust yourself. You were always the stronger one of us two, even when you didn't know it." I sat for a long time holding the journal, just holding it, feeling the weight of the leather, the texture of pages Gerald had written on. He had written those words knowing he might not come home. I whispered to the empty room. "Oh, Gerald," had sat somewhere in these same mountains under these same stars and thought of me specifically, not the land, not the money, not the legal documents. Me. Tomorrow, Graham and I would find whatever he had left behind. Tonight, I let myself miss him without reservation. I closed the journal carefully, placed it under my head like a pillow. Outside, an owl called. The fire crackled. Wind moved through pine branches with a sound like the ocean. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, I slept deeply. No nightmares about Barrett's face when he'd driven away. No dreams of Celeste's cold smile. No phantom sounds of footsteps in hallways. Just sleep, deep and dreamless and complete. When I woke in the morning, sunlight was filtering through gaps in the walls. The fire had burned down to embers. The journal was still warm beneath my head. Graham would be here soon, and together we would follow Gerald's map into the blackberry brambles behind the shack. The 11th morning dawned heavy with mist, and Graham and I followed Gerald's hand-drawn map into the blackberry brambles behind the shack. 15 paces northeast from the lightning-struck oak. That's what the map said. The brambles tore at my clothes as we pushed through, but I barely felt them. "Here," Graham said, kneeling. "According to Gerald's map, it should be right there. See that edge?" I crouched beside him. At first I saw nothing, just leaves and damp black soil and more brambles. Then Graham pulled away a layer of debris, and I saw it. Metal. A cleverly camouflaged steel hatch that would be invisible to anyone not looking for it. My hands shook as I pulled out the key Graham had given me days ago. The brass was warm from my pocket. I fitted it into the lock. It turned smoothly. The bunker door swung open with a pneumatic hiss, revealing darkness below. Then, as if Gerald himself had reached up through time to welcome me back up, LED lighting systems slowly illuminated. Solar-charged battery banks Gerald had written in the journal enough to last a decade. "He built all of this," I whispered. "Well, I thought he was just surveying for the Park Service." Graham nodded. "Everything designed to last years." I descended the iron ladder into a space that smelled of cedar and machine oil. Gerald's smell. The smell of his workshop on winter evenings when he'd tinker with equipment while I graded papers at the kitchen table. I stood at the bottom of the ladder and felt for the first time since his funeral that he was still here somehow, still present, still in his quiet and methodical way, taking care of me. The bunker was larger than I'd expected. Concrete floors, sturdy wooden shelves lined with neatly stacked moisture-proof plastic bins, everything organized with the methodical precision that had defined Gerald's entire life. Labels on every container. Categories: emergency supplies in one section, tools in another, food storage, water filtration equipment, first aid. The space was dry, climate-controlled, functional. Graham climbed down behind me, his boots echoing on the concrete. He spent 3 years building this, Graham said quietly. Nobody knew, not the Park Service, not Barrett, not even me until he showed me last September. September, 1 month before Gerald died. He knew, I said. Somehow he knew exactly what was coming. I walked along the shelves, touching labels written in Gerald's precise handwriting. Medical supplies, blankets, batteries, rope, everything I might need to survive. He'd built me a fortress, a sanctuary, a place where no one could find me if I didn't want to be found. Graham moved to the far wall where another door was set into the concrete. This one was heavier, reinforced. "There's more," he said. He pried it open with effort. It swung wide, revealing not another room, but a natural cavern wall, deep underground. I pulled out my flashlight, one of the supplies Graham had brought days ago, and shined it into the darkness. The beam illuminated veins of rose quartz running through massive rock face, and something else, mineral deposits with metallic luster catching the light like stars. The veins extended far beyond what we could see, disappearing into darkness that suggested the deposit ran deep into the mountain. Gerald had this analyzed by a private geological firm in Roanoke, Graham said. The deposit extends at least 200 feet deep, conservative estimate $40 to $60 million. I stood there staring at the rock face, trying to process the number. 40 to 60 million, I repeated. Barrett called this land worthless. Barrett never knew what was under it. I turned away from the cavern wall, back to the organized bunker, back to the evidence of my husband's love made manifest in concrete and steel, and carefully labeled bins. "Where's the steel box?" I asked. Graham pointed to a shelf. There, just like the map showed. The box was fireproof, waterproof, locked with the same key that had opened the hatch. I opened it with hands that had stopped shaking and started to feel steady, purposeful, inside neatly organized. The original land deed, Sycamore Ridge, exclusively in my name. Gerald's name had never been on it. He'd made sure of that decades ago. Geological reports officially approved by the Virginia Department of Mines, dated and stamped, legal, irrefutable, and a white envelope sealed. 2 words written on the front in Gerald's handwriting, "Open last." I picked up the envelope, held it for a long moment, felt the weight of whatever Gerald had written inside. Not yet. I set it aside carefully, placed it back in the steel box. "What's wrong?" Graham asked. "Nothing," I said. "I just need to understand everything else first." I picked up the land deed instead, read through it carefully, every word, every clause, every signature. My name, only my name. Barrett had tried to steal this, had abandoned me in the wilderness thinking desperation would force me to sign it over, had called me a burden, had told me to haunt this place with Gerald. But Gerald had been 3 steps ahead all along, $40 to $60 million. Gerald had found this and said nothing, not to me, not to anyone, and had instead spent his last years making sure Barrett could never touch it. "There's something else," Graham said quietly. He reached into the steel box and pulled out a small brown envelope I'd missed. It had been clipped to the back of the geological report. I took it from him, opened it. Inside, laboratory results. Toxicology, dated August 2022. Gerald's name at the top. And below that, in clinical medical terminology, I barely understood confirmation of what some part of me had known since that night in the hospital. Traces of amatoxin, lethal concentrations, consistent with mushroom poisoning. But there was one more piece of paper in that box clipped to the back of the geological report. I turned my attention to the other documents in the steel box, reading each one with the methodical patience Gerald had always admired in me. Geological reports from the private firm in Roanoke. Detailed, technical, thorough. Virginia Department of Mines approval documents officially stamped and dated. Updated land surveys showing exact property boundaries. Mineral rights certifications proving exclusive ownership. Everything organized with Gerald's characteristic precision. Labeled, dated, cross-referenced. I picked up each document, read it carefully, set it aside. Graham stood quietly near the ladder, giving me space to process the magnitude of what my husband had prepared in secret. "Everything is here," I said. Permit surveys, mineral analysis, he documented everything. He spent 3 years making sure every detail was perfect. Graham said. Legal, thorough, unassailable. This was Gerald, methodical, precise, leaving nothing to chance. I'd spent 32 years married to a man who prepared emergency kits for camping trips 6 months in advance, who labeled every tool in his workshop, who kept meticulous records of every forest survey he'd ever conducted. Of course, he'd documented the most important discovery of his life with the same attention to detail. But there was something else. Clipped to the back of the final geological report, I discovered a small brown envelope I'd initially missed. It was tucked behind the larger documents, easy to overlook if you weren't searching carefully. The letterhead made my breath catch. Charlottesville Toxicology Lab. Dated August 22, 2022, 3 months before Gerald died. "Alice," Graham started. "He knew," I whispered. 3 months before he died, he already knew something was wrong. My hands were shaking as I broke the seal on that envelope. Some part of me already knew what I would find inside. Some part of me had known since the moment he died that something was very, very wrong. Before I show you what that toxicology report revealed, are you still with me? Comment A if you think Gerald knew who was poisoning him, or B if you think he died not knowing. Add one reason why. A quick note. The next part includes some fictionalized details to convey the emotional truth. The lesson is what matters. I pulled out the single sheet of paper, medical letterhead, clinical terminology I barely understood, but the summary at the bottom was written in plain English. Blood sample analysis. Traces of amatoxin detected. Concentration levels consistent with repeated low-dose exposure. Source Amanita phalloides. Common name, death cap mushroom. Found throughout Appalachian region. Toxicity lethal if untreated. Symptoms typically appear 6 to 24 hours after ingestion, progressing to liver and kidney failure. I read it 3 times before the words stopped swimming. Gerald had been poisoned. Not sick, not mysteriously declining, not suffering from some undiagnosed condition the doctors couldn't identify. Poisoned, deliberately, slowly. But it was Gerald's handwritten notes in the margin that made something crack in my chest. His precise engineering script, the same handwriting that had labeled every bin in this bunker. The supplement capsules Barrett brought began 3 weeks before symptoms. I don't want to believe this, but I cannot ignore what the numbers show. If you're reading this, Alice, this is a lead, not proof. You'll need the proper authorities to confirm it. I'm documenting everything I can while I still have the clarity to do so, but I cannot accuse my own son without more evidence. I hope I'm wrong. I pray I'm wrong. But if I'm not, please be careful. Trust Graham, and don't sign anything. I set the paper down very carefully on the concrete floor. My hands had stopped shaking. Something cold and clear had settled in their place. "Graham," I said quietly. "I know," he said. "Gerald sent me a copy last September." September, the month before he died. "You knew," I said. "It wasn't an accusation, just a statement." "I knew he suspected," Graham said, but he didn't want to believe it. He kept thinking there might be another explanation, that maybe Barrett didn't know the supplements were contaminated, that maybe it was an accident. "Do you think it was an accident?" Graham was quiet for a long moment. "No," he said finally, "I don't." I looked back at the toxicology report, at Gerald's careful handwriting documenting his own murder, because that's what this was. Not mysterious illness, not tragic decline, murder. My son had killed his father. Or someone had convinced him to. I thought about Celeste, about her cold eyes and calculating smile, about Vincent Cross and the shared surname, about the systematic campaign to break me down, isolate me, force me to sign over land worth tens of millions of dollars, about Barrett's voice on the phone, "They're going to break my hands, Mom," about the desperate quality in his words, the fear. Had Barrett known what was in those supplements, or had someone given them to him, told him they would help his father, not knowing or not caring what they actually contained? My husband had documented his own poisoning, had done it carefully, methodically, the way he did everything, and had left me the beginning of a path rather than the end of one. I sat very still for a very long time. Then I looked at Graham and said, "I need to talk to someone with the authority to do what Gerald couldn't." Graham nodded slowly. "I know someone," he said. "Retired FBI, worked white-collar crime and elder abuse cases for 20 years. He owes me a favor. Can he help? If anyone can, he can. But Alice..." Graham's voice was gentle. "Once you make this call, there's no taking it back. The investigation will go where it goes, even if that means places you don't want it to go." I looked at the toxicology report, at my husband's handwriting, at the evidence he'd carefully assembled while dying. "Make the call," I said. Graham knew exactly who to call. Graham knew a man who knew a man, and by that afternoon every document in Gerald's steel box was being reviewed by someone with a federal badge. Graham made the call from his house 1 mile outside Millhaven. I sat at his kitchen table listening to him explain the situation to someone he'd worked with years ago on a Forest Service case that had turned into federal timber fraud. Because the fraud had crossed state lines through wire transfers, the case fell under federal jurisdiction, which meant the FBI could pursue both the financial crimes and Gerald's death under the same umbrella. "I'm sending you something you need to see," Graham said into the phone. "Elder abuse case, possible homicide. The victim documented everything before he died." There was a pause while the person on the other end spoke. "Yes," Graham said. "Private toxicology report showing poisoning, geological surveys proving massive fraud, timeline of financial exploitation, all of it meticulously documented." Another pause. "I'll scan and send everything tonight, but this needs eyes on it fast. The widow is at risk." He hung up and looked at me. "Now we wait," he said. Waiting turned out to be the hardest part. By early April, after nearly a month on the ridge, Graham drove me to his house where the real work could begin. For 7 days, April 12th through 19th, I stayed at Graham's house compiling additional documentation. I wrote a meticulous timeline of every event since Gerald's death. The funeral, moving into Barrett's mansion, the small room with no lock, Celeste's systematic humiliation campaign, the dinner party, the document I'd unknowingly signed, the abandonment, everything. I organized it the way Gerald would have chronologically with supporting evidence cross-referenced. "What if they say it's not enough?" I asked Graham on the 3rd day. "What if—" "Gerald was thorough," Graham interrupted gently. "Trust that. 7 days feels like 7 years when you're waiting for someone to confirm that your husband was murdered. But I had spent 32 years teaching patience to children. I could wait." On the 7th day, the phone finally rang. Graham answered, listened, then handed it to me. "Mrs. Mercer." A woman's voice said, professional, calm. "This is Special Agent Rafferty. I've reviewed the materials Graham forwarded. I need to ask you some questions." Special Agent Rafferty, 47 with 15 years in federal investigations, spent the next hour asking me to walk through everything. She didn't interrupt, didn't question, just listened and took notes. Then she said the words I'd been waiting a week to hear. "Mrs. Mercer, there is more than enough probable cause to open a federal investigation under elder financial abuse and wire fraud statutes, Virginia Code 182178.1 and U.S. Code 181343. I closed my eyes, took a breath. "Regarding your husband," Agent Rafferty continued, "we will secure an official exhumation order from a Virginia court for forensic testing. Your husband's private toxicology report is the catalyst, but we need official confirmation for prosecution. Do you understand?" Yes, I said, this is a federal case now, which means we do this properly, by the book. No shortcuts. Are you willing to participate as a cooperating witness? I looked at Graham. He nodded. Agent Rafferty, I said calmly. I believe I have some relevant experience in that area. There was a pause, then something that might have been a smile in her voice. 32 years as an elementary school teacher. Yes, I saw that in your file. Good. We'll need that skill set. 3 days later, an FBI technician arrived at Sycamore Ridge. He was young, maybe 30, with the kind of technical expertise that made complicated things look simple. He installed hidden audio recording equipment inside the shack devices so small I wouldn't have noticed them if I hadn't watched him place them. Then he fitted me with a wire. An inconspicuous microphone that clipped beneath my collar transmitter, tucked into a small pocket sewn into my jacket lining. This gesture activates the recording, he said, showing me a subtle movement touching my collar in a specific way. Practice until it's second nature. Graham set up peripheral surveillance cameras monitoring the access road. Anyone approaching would be recorded. That evening, Graham helped me practice. He role-played Barrett, stood across the shack from me, and delivered the kind of desperate, angry demands I knew were coming. Mom, you have to sign the deed. Right now. They're going to kill me if you don't. I stayed ice cold, precise, refused to let emotion dictate my vocabulary. Barrett, I need to understand what's happening. Walk me through this from the beginning. Graham kept pushing the way Barrett would push, but I didn't break, didn't let anger make me careless. Just asked questions, stayed calm, let him talk. Graham stopped the drill mid-sentence. Gerald always said you were the smart one, he said. Gerald was biased, I replied. We both laughed. The first real laugh either of us had shared in weeks. But that night, after Graham had gone home and I sat alone by the fire practicing the activation gesture over and over, something clicked into place. I thought about Barrett's mistakes, the document fraud that failed because he'd given me the wrong papers to sign, the flip phone he'd provided thinking it would isolate me, not realizing it was my only lifeline, the land he'd thought was worthless, never knowing Gerald had found a fortune beneath it. That night, practicing alone by the fire, I realized something. Every mistake Barrett had made since October had been in its own way a gift. The wrong papers, the forgotten phone, the land he thought was worthless. He had handed me everything I needed. I just had to know how to use it. I touched my collar, activated the wire, deactivated it, practiced until the gesture felt natural, until I could do it without thinking. Because tomorrow Agent Rafferty had instructed me to do something very specific. Tomorrow, I would deliberately reinsert the battery into the flip phone for exactly 30 minutes. Long enough for Barrett's tracking device, Agent Rafferty had found a GPS chip no larger than a fingernail tucked beneath the phone's back panel to ping my coordinates. Long enough to bring him back to Sycamore Ridge. And when he came desperate and demanding, I would be ready. The FBI would be listening. The cameras would be recording, and Barrett would finally tell me the truth. And tomorrow I would get my chance. Under Agent Rafferty's instructions, I put the battery back into the flip phone for exactly 30 minutes. Graham had positioned himself earlier that morning, disappearing into the tree line with the kind of quiet competence that came from decades of forest work. I'll be in the tree line, he'd said. You won't see me, but I'll see everything. I stood in front of the patched-up shack Gerald had left me wire microphone concealed beneath my jacket and watched the seconds tick by on the flip phone screen. The phone sat in my palm, its battery powering the tiny chip that was already broadcasting my location. I wasn't prey anymore. I was bait, but bait with teeth. After exactly 30 minutes, I removed the battery again and waited. 2 hours later, I heard the car. The engine sound came first too fast on the dirt road tires struggling for purchase on the uneven ground, then the slam of a car door, stumbling footsteps. Barrett emerged from the trees with the posture of a man completely out of options. He looked terrible. Clothes rumpled, face unshaven, eyes wild with the kind of desperation that comes from watching your entire world collapse. He saw me standing there and dropped to his knees in the dirt. "Mom," he said. "Mom, I'm sorry. I panicked. I shouldn't have. His voice broke. "Just sign the land over to me," he continued, words tumbling out. I'll make everything right, I swear. I'll pay you back. Barrett, I said quietly, and stand up. He stayed on his knees. Stand up, I repeated, and tell me everything from the very beginning. He stood slowly brushing dirt from his pants, looking at me with something like hope. The beginning, he said. Mom, I don't... The debt, I said. How much? Who you owe? How it happened? All of it. And he talked. For 40 minutes, Barrett stood there and told me everything. About the leveraged investments that went bad, about Vincent Cross and the loans that came with impossible interest rates, about Celeste's family connections that had seemed like salvation until they became a noose, about the night he drove me into these mountains convinced that if I just disappeared for a while, I'd be desperate enough to sign anything. He talked for 40 minutes. I watched him and saw, just for a moment, the 8-year-old who used to cry when he fell off his bicycle. That child was gone. This desperate man had killed him long before he ever drove me into these mountains. He never once mentioned Gerald's supplements, never mentioned the toxicology report I knew existed, never said the word poison, but he said enough, more in fact than enough. Every word recorded on the wire beneath my jacket, every confession captured by cameras hidden in the trees. When he finally stopped talking, I let the silence settle. So, what you're telling me, I said carefully, is that you brought me here to force me to sign over land you needed to pay your debts. Yes, he said. But Mom, I was going to come back for you, I swear. I needed time to... To what, Barrett? He looked at his feet. I don't know, he whispered. I took a breath, felt the wire against my skin, thought about Agent Rafferty listening to every word. I'll return to Richmond, I said. His head snapped up, hope flooding his face. We can sign the papers properly, I continued. At the Jefferson Hotel restaurant, Saturday evening. Bring Celeste. This involves both of you. Yes, Barrett said. Yes, thank you, Mom. I knew you'd understand. I knew if I just explained. The Jefferson Hotel, I repeated. 6 p.m. Don't be late. I won't. I promise. I'll set it all up. We can do the paperwork right there. I'll bring everything you need to sign. He was practically vibrating with relief. Thank you, he said again. Thank you. I'll make this right. I promise. Then he was back in his car engine, roaring to life, speeding away in a cloud of dust that hung in the afternoon air long after the sound of his engine had faded. I stood there until the dust settled. Graham stepped out from the tree line. We looked at each other across the clearing. No words necessary. He'd heard everything, seen everything. He nodded once. I nodded back. Then I walked into the shelter Gerald had built and made coffee from the provisions he'd left. Real coffee, not the instant powder I'd been using. The smell filled the small space, rich and dark and grounding. I sat with Gerald's journal as the sun set over the Appalachians, watched the sky turn from blue to purple to black, watched the stars come out one by one. Saturday evening, the Jefferson Hotel restaurant. Barrett and Celeste sitting across from me at a table thinking they were about to get everything they wanted. They had no idea what was waiting for them. Agent Rafferty would be there listening. Cameras would capture everything, and I would finally get the answers to questions I'd been asking since the moment Gerald died. Whatever happened in that restaurant, I had been planning longer, and I had had a much better teacher. I thought about Gerald, about the meticulous way he'd documented everything, about the bunker he'd built and the evidence he'd gathered and the path he'd laid out for me to follow, about the journal I held in my hands filled with his precise handwriting and careful observations and quiet love. Barrett had learned from Celeste, from Vincent Cross, from people who saw other humans as tools to be used and discarded. I had learned from Gerald, from a man who spent 40 years protecting forests and 3 years protecting me. It wasn't even a fair fight. Graham would drive me back to Richmond on a brilliantly green Virginia morning. The headlights carved through pre-dawn darkness as Graham's sedan left Sycamore Ridge behind. 3 days had passed since Barrett drove away believing I'd agreed to sign over everything. 3 days of preparation. 3 days of rehearsing what I would and wouldn't say. 3 days of Gerald's journal lying open on my makeshift table, its pages filled with his precise handwriting and final truths. Now, watching the familiar mountains disappear in the rearview mirror, I carried that journal with me. Carried everything Gerald had left behind. Carried the weight of what I was about to do. Graham drove in focused silence, hands steady on the wheel as Virginia landscape transformed from mountain to Piedmont. I'd read Gerald's final journal entry last night by candlelight, and the words still echoed in my head. It wasn't about the land. Wasn't about the mineral deposits or the money or any of the practical preparations he'd made. It was a letter to me. Alice, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And I'm sorry. Sorry I wasn't brave enough to stand up to Celeste all those years. Sorry I let her treat you the way she did. Sorry I chose peace over principle too many times to count. Barrett learned from what I didn't do as much as from what I did. I hope you'll be braver than I was. I hope you'll have the courage I lacked. You were always the stronger one. I just wish I'd said it more often. I closed my eyes, feeling the motion of the car carrying me east toward Richmond, toward whatever came next. Dawn broke as we approached Charlottesville, turning the sky from black to gray to pale gold. Graham pulled off at a roadside diner, the kind of place with vinyl booths and coffee that had been sitting too long on the burner. We sat across from each other, steam rising from our cups, toast on my plate that I couldn't bring myself to eat. At the booth beside us, a young couple argued in hushed, tense voices. "I want the ceremony to be perfect," the woman said, scrolling through something on her phone. "White roses, not cream. The difference matters." "Does it?" the man asked quietly. "Does any of that actually matter?" "Of course it matters. Everything has to be exactly right." Graham and I exchanged a glance, a small knowing look that said everything without words. This was the life I was leaving behind, the performance, the pursuit of someone else's version of perfect. Graham's hand moved across the table, stopping just short of mine. "Whatever happens today," he said quietly, "I'll be right outside." I looked at this man who'd appeared in the tree line when I needed him most, who'd built fires and brought supplies and never once asked for anything in return, who'd known Gerald's secrets and kept them, who'd positioned cameras and rehearsed confrontations and stood guard while I slept. This quiet man had become my unexpected anchor in the storm. "Thank you," I said. He nodded. We drank our coffee, watched the sun rise over Virginia. By mid-morning, we arrived at the Jefferson Hotel in Richmond. Baroque grandeur, marble floors, crystal chandeliers throwing light like diamonds. It felt both familiar, I'd been here for charity events with Gerald years ago, and utterly alien. The last time I'd walked through these doors, I'd been someone else. Someone who smiled and made polite conversation and pretended not to notice when Celeste made small cutting remarks about my dress or my hair or the way I held my wine glass. That woman was gone. Special Agent Rafferty waited near the lobby windows dressed in understated business attire that made her look like any other professional meeting a client. She approached with a small velvet box. "Mrs. Mercer," she said quietly, "final equipment check." Inside the box was a delicate necklace. Simple. Elegant. The kind of thing no one would look at twice, except for the tiny transmitter hidden in the pendant. Rafferty fastened it around my neck with practiced efficiency, tapped it once, spoke into her own concealed microphone. "Test transmission," she said. Somewhere nearby, I knew federal agents were confirming they could hear every word. Across the lobby, a man sat at a small table reviewing documents with the kind of attention that suggested nothing escaped his notice. Conrad Blackwell, a thin, 48-year-old attorney specializing in property law, reviewed the documents with eyes that missed nothing. He was here as a witness, as insurance, as one more piece of Gerald's careful planning brought to life. I excused myself to the powder room, took the elevator up one floor where the mirrors were better lit, and I could see myself clearly. The reflection staring back was a woman in simple clothes, no designer labels, no perfect makeup. Hair pulled back in a practical style that Celeste would have called unfortunate. I could change. There was time. I could smooth my hair, apply lipstick, transform myself into the version Celeste had always wanted me to be. But as I stood there looking at my own face, something crystallized. Celeste had spent 40 years trying to make everyone fit her image of perfection. Barrett, Gerald, me. molding and criticizing and reshaping until we all performed the roles she'd written for us. My power came from refusing to play that game. I would walk into that dining room exactly as I was, not as who Celeste wanted, as myself. I rode the elevator back down, walked through the lobby where a wedding party had just arrived, bride in an elaborate gown, entourage fussing over every detail of her veil and train and flowers. The chaos swirled around them, everyone performing, everyone desperate for perfection. I walked past them all with quiet certainty. Agent Rafferty gave me the smallest nod. Graham caught my eye through the lobby windows. He'd positioned himself across the street, visible waiting, just like he'd promised. Conrad Blackwell gathered his documents, moving toward the dining room where Barrett had reserved a private table. The restaurant doors stood 20 feet away. I adjusted the delicate necklace one last time, feeling the weight of the tiny transmitter against my collarbone. Took one breath, then another. I belonged here more than Celeste ever did. The candle flame between us cast Barrett's shadow across Celeste's face, making them look like one creature with two heads. They were already seated when I walked into the private dining room. Barrett in the suit he'd worn to Gerald's funeral, Celeste in designer black that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. A thick legal folder sat on the table between them like an offering. Barrett stood when he saw me, relief washing over his face. "Mom," he said, "thank you for coming. Thank you for understanding." I took my seat across from them. The table was polished mahogany, white linen, silver that caught the candlelight. A waiter appeared. I ordered wine without looking at the menu. Barrett opened his mouth to speak, but I raised one finger. Not yet. The wine arrived. I took a sip, let the silence stretch. "How is your father doing, Celeste?" I asked, my voice perfectly pleasant. Vincent Cross of Cross Financial, still in good health. Celeste's face drained of color. Not completely, not fast enough to hide the recognition, but enough to tell me everything I needed to know. The silence at the table was absolute. "I thought so," I said quietly. "Shall we begin?" Barrett looked between us, confused. "Mom, what are you—" "Your wife," I said, still looking at Celeste, "isn't who she says she is." Celeste's expression froze into something cold and calculating, the mask she'd been wearing for years finally dropping. "Be very careful," she said softly. "Celeste Cross Mercer." I continued. "Maiden name Cross, daughter of Vincent Cross, the same man currently holding your debts, the same man who's been systematically destroying you for the past 3 years. Barrett's face went white. "What? Your marriage wasn't Love Barrett. It was an engineered corporate raid. Celeste married you to get access to information about Gerald's land, to position herself inside our family so she could acquire it when the time was right." "That's insane," Celeste said, but her voice was too controlled, too practiced. I reached into my bag and pulled out documents Graham had helped me compile. Bank statements, wire transfer records. 2 weeks ago, I said, sliding them across the table. "Celeste wire transferred the last of your liquid assets to Cross Financial, not to pay down the debt, to her father. Your wife has been systematically moving your money into her family's accounts since before Gerald died." Barrett picked up the documents with shaking hands, read them. "Read them again." "No," he whispered. "No, you're lying." I looked at Celeste. "Tell him. Tell your husband who your father really is." Celeste's hand trembled. Wine tipped from her glass, pooling red across the white tablecloth like slow-motion blood. "This is ridiculous," she said, but there was no conviction in her voice anymore. "You married him to steal from him," I said. "You moved into our lives, made yourself indispensable, isolated me, humiliated me, all so Barrett would be desperate enough to do whatever you wanted." "Mom," Barrett started, "the land would have covered everything." Celeste snapped her facade, finally cracking. "All of it. Your mother's worthless mountain property would have paid off every debt, saved your pathetic company, and no one would have been hurt. But she had to be stubborn, had to be weak." "Weak," I said quietly. "Yes, weak." Celeste's voice rose. "If you'd just signed the papers in December like you were supposed to, none of this would have been necessary. But you had to make everything difficult. You had to—" "The land isn't worthless," I interrupted. "It never was. Gerald found mineral deposits worth tens of millions of dollars. He documented everything, and he made absolutely certain that land would never fall into your hands." Barrett was staring at Celeste like he'd never seen her before. "You knew," he whispered. "All this time you knew the land was valuable." "Of course I knew," Celeste said. "My father has known since before we got married. Why do you think I chose you?" The words hung in the air, poisonous, final. Barrett's voice cracked on the word Dad, and in that moment I saw not the man who had abandoned me on a mountain, but the child I had once held when he cried. "And my father," Barrett said, his voice barely audible. "What about Gerald?" Celeste went very still. "What about him?" she said carefully. "Dad didn't just get sick," Barrett said. His voice was rising, shaking. "The supplements you found, the ones you said would help with his energy. He stopped, looked at her with dawning horror. "You knew about the supplements, Celeste," he shouted. "You were the one who found them. You said they were all natural, that they'd help him feel better. But he got worse, and you kept telling me to make sure he took them and—" His voice broke completely. "You killed him," he whispered. "Oh my God, you killed my father." Celeste's eyes went cold. "You knew the supplements were special, Barrett. You're the one who kept refilling them from the cabinet I showed you. You're the one who made sure he never missed a dose." She said it quietly, deliberately, not a confession but a redistribution of guilt. Barrett's face collapsed. He had known the supplements came from Celeste's private stock. He had known Gerald's doctor hadn't prescribed them. He had simply chosen not to ask why. The dining room had gone absolutely silent. Other diners had stopped mid-conversation, waiters frozen in place, everyone staring at our table. Celeste's face was stone. Barrett's was ash. I touched the necklace at my throat, felt the transmitter still warm against my skin, every word recorded, every confession captured. "There are people who have been waiting to speak with both of you," I said quietly. I didn't gesture toward the lobby, didn't need to, but Celeste's eyes flicked there anyway. And in that moment, she knew. She knew I'd been wearing a wire, knew everything she'd just said had been recorded, knew that Barrett's confession about the supplements was on federal record. She knew the trap had closed. The FBI was closing in. The silence after Barrett's confession lasted 3 heartbeats. Then Conrad Blackwell reached into his briefcase with the calm precision of a man who had witnessed 1,000 moments like this and never flinched. The manila folder he placed on the table between us bore no label, no law firm insignia, just crisp ivory paper and the weight of everything I had spent 16 months building toward. I slid the document across the table. Settlement Agreement and General Release. The title sat centered at the top in 12-point Times New Roman, as impersonal as surgery. Barrett's hands shook as he picked it up. Celeste leaned in her manicured finger tracing the first paragraph, and I watched comprehension dawn in stages across her face. The mineral rights, the farmland deed, the Sycamore Ridge property in its entirety. All of it flowing back to me the lawful heir in exchange for Barrett's acknowledgement of wrongful appropriation and his waiver of any future claim. Barrett looked up and something like hope flickered in his eyes. The same eyes that used to light up when Gerald brought him to the barn to see the new foals. He thought this was mercy. I could see it in the way his shoulders dropped half an inch, the way his breathing steadied. He thought I was offering him a path forward. I let him believe it. I nodded toward the signature line and said nothing as he reached for Conrad's pen. The FBI needed this signed before the arrest. Special Agent Rafferty had been explicit about the sequencing during our 3 a.m. briefing yesterday. Secure the property transfer first, let Barrett confirm in writing what he had taken, then bring the handcuffs. The formal deed transfer would be filed at the Henrico County Recorder's office Monday morning. Conrad had the paperwork ready. Conrad witnessed the signature with a notary stamp that echoed in the quiet restaurant like a gavel. Celeste signed as co-respondent, her hand steadier than her son's, and I wondered if she understood yet, if she knew that Vincent Cross's daughter had just ensured that his grandson would inherit nothing but the consequences of his own choices. Barrett set down the pen and met my eyes. "Thank you," he said. His voice broke on the second word. "Thank you for giving me a chance to make this right." I folded my hands on the table and said nothing, because there were no words for what I felt in that moment. Not triumph, not vindication, just the cold, clear knowledge that justice and mercy were not the same thing, and I had chosen only one. The restaurant doors opened. Special Agent Rafferty entered first, flanked by 2 federal agents in Navy windbreakers, with FBI stenciled across the back in yellow block letters. Behind them came 4 Virginia State Troopers in their gray uniforms and campaign hats, their expressions carved from stone. The breakfast diners looked up from their eggs, Benedict and mimosas forks frozen halfway to open mouths. Rafferty stopped at our table. She held 2 folded documents in her left hand, arrest warrants. I had seen them yesterday during the briefing, had watched her slide them into a leather portfolio with the same clinical detachment Conrad had just shown with the settlement papers. "Barrett Mercer," she said, "you are under arrest for elder financial abuse, wire fraud, and second-degree murder in the death of Gerald Arthur Mercer." The second agent moved behind Barrett's chair and produced steel handcuffs from his belt. Barrett's face went the color of old paper. He looked at me, then at Celeste, then back at the settlement agreement still lying on the table between us. I saw the moment he understood. The hope drained from his eyes like water through a sieve. Celeste stood so quickly her chair scraped against the marble floor. "This is a mistake," she said. Her voice had lost its cultivated warmth. "This is harassment. We just signed a settlement. We cooperated." Rafferty turned to her with the same flat calm she had used on Barrett. "Celeste Hargrove, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit elder financial abuse and accessory to second-degree murder. You have the right to remain silent." The handcuffs closed around Barrett's wrists with a double click that I will hear for the rest of my life. The sound of metal on bone. The sound of 16 months collapsing into one irreversible instant. The second pair went on Celeste, and she stared at them as if they were a piece of jewelry she could not quite recognize. Conrad returned the settlement papers to his briefcase and stood. The notary stamp disappeared into an inner pocket. He nodded to me once, a gesture of professional acknowledgement that held no judgment and no comfort, and then he walked toward the exit. The agents guided Barrett and Celeste toward the door. Guests pulled their chairs aside to clear a path. A woman in a blue dress pressed her napkin to her mouth. A man in a business suit held up his phone recording until one of the troopers stepped into his line of sight and shook his head once. Barrett stumbled at the threshold. Agent Rafferty steadied him with one hand on his elbow, her grip firm but not rough. He looked back. His eyes found mine across 20 feet of restaurant floor, across 16 months of lies and legal filings, and recorded confessions across the unmarked grave of the family we used to be. I did not look away. I held his gaze and let him see what I had become. Not the girl who used to make him birthday cakes shaped like tractors. Not the woman who smiled through Thanksgiving dinners while her own son forged her husband's signature on deed transfers. Someone else. Someone who had chosen justice over mercy and would carry that choice until the day I joined Gerald in whatever silence waited beyond all of this. He broke first. He turned away and let the agents guide him through the doors and into the May sunlight. I sat alone at the table. The candle between us had burned down to a stub. My untouched coffee had gone cold. Outside, car doors slammed. Engines started. The restaurant murmured back to life around me, forks clinking against plates, someone laughing nervously near the kitchen. I picked up my purse and stood. My legs felt like someone else's. The hostess met my eyes as I walked toward the exit, and I saw something there I could not name. Pity, maybe, or recognition. The doors closed behind me, and I stepped into the morning alone. The amber lamps cast the kind of warm light that made everything look gentler than it was, but my hands still shook around the teacup. 6 hours had passed since the handcuffs closed. 6 hours since I walked out of that restaurant and found Graham waiting in the lobby, his face carved with quiet concern. He had not asked questions. He had simply guided me to this alcove behind a marble pillar, ordered tea I could not taste, and sat across from me in a leather chair worn soft by a century of grief. The hotel had emptied as evening settled. Beyond the curtains, traffic hummed along Franklin Street. A piano played in the distant bar, something slow and minor key. But here, in this pocket of warmth and shadow, there was only silence. Graham had not spoken in 40 minutes. He sat with his hands folded, giving me the rarest gift anyone had offered in 16 months: permission to feel nothing. Permission to sit in the wreckage without performing strength or composure, or any of the costumes I had worn since the day I found Gerald cold in his bed. The tea had gone lukewarm. I set the cup down, and the faint clink of porcelain against saucer sounded too loud. My reflection wavered in the curve of the silver teapot. Same gray hair pulled back in the same practical twist. Same lines around the same eyes. But the woman staring back had signed a settlement agreement, then watched federal agents walk her stepson out in handcuffs while she sat motionless as stone. Graham's hand crossed the small table and settled over mine. No pressure, no words, just warmth, solid and real. I opened my mouth and heard my voice crack. Is it wrong that I don't feel victorious? He did not answer immediately. He let the question sit between us, turning it over. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet enough that I had to lean forward. No, he said. It means you were fighting for the right reasons. Something broke loose inside my chest. Not relief, not vindication. Something older and deeper grief that lives in the marrow and waits for permission to surface. I realized with a clarity that felt like falling that I was not crying because justice had failed. I was crying because it had succeeded, because Barrett Mercer was in a holding cell tonight, facing charges that could send him to prison for decades, and none of that changed the fact that he was still Gerald's son. Still the boy I had held when he was 3 years old and fell off the porch swing. The child who had cried into my shoulder while I pressed ice to the bruise blooming on his forehead. Gerald had loved him, had tried to teach him what it meant to be a steward of land and legacy, and Barrett had chosen a different path, had chosen Celeste's vision shortcuts and forged signatures, everything except the man who raised him. The tears came without sound, hot and relentless. I pressed my hands against my eyes, but they kept falling. This was the 4th time I had cried since Gerald died. Once at the funeral, once in Dr. Embry's office when she handed me the toxicology report, once in my lawyer's conference room when Special Agent Rafferty played the wire recording. And now, the silence between us was not empty. It held everything too heavy for words, the way snow accumulates on branches until they bow under the weight of what they cannot release. Graham did not try to fill it. He did not offer platitudes about time or healing. He simply stayed. His hand remained over mine, an anchor that did not pull me anywhere, just kept me from drifting into the dark current, tugging at the edges. Minutes passed. The piano shifted to something slower. A couple walked past the alcove, their laughter soft and private, and I envied them the lightness of whatever brought them here. When the tears finally stopped, I felt hollow, scraped clean. I pulled my hands back and reached for a napkin, wiping my face with movements that felt mechanical and far away. Graham leaned back. He studied me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in his expression. Not pity, something closer to recognition. "Gerald left you more than evidence," he said quietly. "Didn't he?" My hand moved automatically to the pocket of my jacket. The letter. I had carried it every day since I found it in the lockbox tucked beneath the mineral survey and the updated will. I had read it so many times the creases had started to fray the ink, fading where my fingers touched the same words over and over. I had thought it was a confession, a roadmap to the truth, instructions on how to prove what Barrett had done and reclaim what he had stolen. But sitting here 6 hours after the handcuffs clicked shut, I understood something I had been too angry and too focused to see before. Gerald had not written that letter to help me win. He had written it to show me what to build after I did. The paper crinkled as I pulled it from my pocket. I did not unfold it. I just held it, feeling the weight of his handwriting pressed into fiber, the ghost of his presence in every careful line. He had known he would not see whatever came next, had known with the clarity of a man who felt poison working through his blood that he was writing to a future he would never inhabit, but he had trusted me to build it anyway. Graham's voice cut through the quiet. "Go home," he said, not unkindly. "Build what he asked you to build." I looked up and met his eyes. They were steady and calm, holding no judgment and no expectation, just an invitation to step forward into whatever came next. I folded the letter and returned it to my pocket. It felt different now. Not like evidence or confession, but like blueprints for something that did not exist yet. Something I would have to imagine into being with my own hands on land I had fought 16 months to reclaim. I stood. My legs felt stronger than they had 6 hours ago. Graham rose with me, and for the first time since the restaurant, I felt something other than grief. I felt ready. 8 months had passed since the arrests, and the dark oak courtroom still smelled like old law books and the particular silence that comes before a judge speaks. I sat in the gallery with my hands folded in my lap, watching Barrett stand beside his attorney in a gray suit that hung loose on shoulders that had narrowed since May. Graham sat 2 rows behind me. I could feel his presence without turning around, steady as a stone wall. The exhumation had been my decision. Gerald's body, which I had buried with white roses and hymns he never sang, pulled from the earth last September by technicians in hazmat suits who treated his remains like evidence instead of memory. The toxicology report came back 3 weeks later. Special Agent Rafferty had delivered it in person, her face unreadable as she slid the folder across the table. Lethal concentrations of amatoxin. Not accidental, not even reckless. Deliberate. Measured. Administered over weeks in doses calculated to mimic natural decline until his liver failed and his heart stopped, and I woke up alone in a house that had already become a crime scene. Barrett's plea deal had been signed the day his attorney saw those numbers. 2nd-degree murder, elder financial exploitation, wire fraud. The alternative was a trial that would end with life imprisonment and no possibility of parole. He had chosen 22 years instead. Celeste stood beside him in a black dress with pearl buttons. Her hands were cuffed in front of her, and she stared straight ahead at the bench with the same blank expression she had worn since the restaurant. Conspiracy to commit murder. Wire fraud. 14 years. Her father, Vincent Cross, had been indicted separately on racketeering charges in a federal case that would not see trial until next year. She would not be there to watch. Judge Helena Carr adjusted her reading glasses and looked down at the sentencing documents. The courtroom held its breath. Somewhere behind me, a reporter's pen scratched against paper. "Barrett Mercer," Judge Carr said. Her voice was flat and final as a closing door. "You are hereby sentenced to 22 years in federal prison without possibility of early parole. You will serve your sentence at a facility to be determined by the Bureau of Prisons." The gavel fell. The sound I had been waiting 8 months to hear landed in the quiet courtroom, both too loud and not loud enough. It echoed off the oak paneling and the tall windows and the faces of strangers who had come to watch justice delivered in 10-second intervals. Barrett did not move. Celeste closed her eyes. Judge Carr turned to me. "Mrs. Mercer, would you like to deliver your victim impact statement?" I stood. My legs felt solid beneath me. I had written the statement 3 times, revised it twice, and finally thrown it away last night in my hotel room. The words I needed were not on paper. They were carved into the 16 months since Gerald died into every forged signature and stolen deed and recorded confession that had brought me here. I looked at Barrett. He would not meet my eyes. "Gerald deserved to watch his grandchildren grow," I said. My voice did not shake. "He deserved to die in his own bed surrounded by people who loved him. He deserved honesty from the son he raised and the land he spent 50 years protecting. He got none of those things. What he got was poison in his supplements and a stepson who cashed checks while his body failed." I paused. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear my own breathing. I hope Barrett spends the next 22 years remembering what he traded for money he didn't need. I sat down. Judge Carr asked Celeste if she had anything to say. Celeste's voice was barely audible. I have nothing to say. 10 minutes later, I stepped out into January Virginia sunshine. The cold air tasted like snow that had not yet fallen, and the particular clarity that comes after something ends. I stood on the courthouse steps and breathed deeply for the first time in 8 months. Graham appeared at my elbow. "Ready?" he asked. I nodded. Ready to leave Richmond. Ready to go home. Ready to build what Gerald had asked me to build, which I finally understood was not a building or a business or a monument. It was a life, my own, on land that would never be taken from me again. February came cold and bright. I returned to Sycamore Ridge on a Thursday morning with frost still clinging to the fence posts and the sky the color of steel. Graham drove. We turned off the highway onto the gravel road I had last seen 9 months ago, and my breath caught. The entire village of Millhaven stood at my gate. 47 people in winter coats and work boots, their breath rising in white clouds against the morning. Behind them, where Gerald's rotting shack had sagged into the mud, stood a small log cabin with a stone chimney and windows that caught the light. Graham stopped the truck. "We thought you might need somewhere to stay," he said quietly, "while you figure out what comes next." I stepped out. Iris Townsend walked forward and pressed a bundle of white winter flowers into my hands. Her eyes were damp. "Welcome home, Alice." Hugh stood beside her hat in his hands. The others watched in silence. Rebuilt a stranger's shack, I thought, because that's what neighbors do in places that still remember what the word means. I walked through the cabin door. The interior smelled like fresh pine and wood smoke. A small stove sat in one corner, a bed frame in another. Through the window, I could see the tree, Gerald's pine, planted the year Barrett was born. 60 feet tall now, straight as a plumb line, its branches reaching toward a sky that had thrown storms at it for 30 years and failed to bend it even once. "He planted that pine the year Barrett was born," I whispered. Graham stood beside me at the window. I know. I understood then what Gerald had been trying to tell me in that letter. He had not given me this land to escape Celeste's world. He had given me roots, something that would hold when everything else fell apart. Something that would stand unbothered by storms. I cried for the 5th time since Gerald died, but these tears tasted different, like winter flowers and new wood and the particular grace of 47 people who barely knew me, but rebuilt my home anyway. They tasted like something that might eventually be called home. Spring sunlight poured through the corporate office windows in a way that made even contract negotiations look like they might contain grace. March had arrived with that particular brightness that follows long winters, and I sat across from 3 attorneys who seemed genuinely confused about why I was turning down millions. The final thread that remained was not about land or money. It was about what I would build with the mountain Gerald had left me and what kind of legacy would outlive us both. James Glenwood, the senior partner, slid 2 folders across the table. "Mrs. Mercer." He said, his voice patient as someone explaining mathematics to a child. "The competing offer is 40% higher. We're talking about substantial difference in your personal financial outcome." I opened the first folder, Summit Ridge Resources. Highest bidder, standard extraction terms, maximum efficiency, minimum local impact. The kind of contract that would make me wealthy and leave Millhaven exactly as it was slowly emptying as young people moved away. I opened the second folder, Appalachian Heritage Mining. Lower bid, different terms. 80% of labor hired from within 50 miles of Millhaven. 15% of gross royalties to the Gerald Mercer Conservation and Education Fund, construction of the Gerald Mercer Community Learning Center on Sycamore Ridge, completed within 18 months. "But they won't hire locally," I said, tapping the first folder, "and they won't fund the education center." Glenwood exchanged glances with his colleagues. "With respect, you could fund your own center with the difference and still have substantial assets remaining." I thought about Gerald's hands calloused from 50 years of working land he loved more than profit. I thought about his letter that had felt like blueprints. I thought about Millhaven rebuilding my cabin without being asked. Because Gerald left me a mountain, not a bank account, I said. There's a considerable difference. I signed the Appalachian Heritage contract. The pen scratched against paper that would transform Gerald's death into something larger than grief. An education fund, a learning center, jobs, a future he would never see but had trusted me to build anyway. When I walked out into spring sunshine, I tasted something sharp and bright on my tongue like the first strawberries of the season. It tasted like purpose. 3 months later, the envelope arrived. It sat on my kitchen table like a test I had not studied for and could not reschedule. FCI Petersburg stamped in the corner, Barrett's handwriting on the address careful and precise. The envelope was patient as mountains, just waiting for me to decide what it deserved. I left it there for 2 days while I worked in the garden, met with the architect about floor plans, watched the mining company hire crews from Millhaven and neighboring towns. On the 3rd day, I opened it. Barrett's letter was 3 pages handwritten on lined paper. He did not ask for money. He did not ask me to visit. He did not make excuses. He wrote about the carpentry workshop where he was learning to build furniture, about the prison library where he had found 3 of Gerald's old forestry textbooks, their pages yellowed and margins filled with his father's cramped annotations, about reading them slowly, finally understanding what Gerald had tried to teach him about stewardship and patience and the difference between owning land and belonging to it. The last paragraph made my hands shake. Mom, I understand now why Dad chose you. You saw the land the way he did as something to protect, not something to spend. I just wish I'd understood that when it still mattered. When he was still here, to know I finally got it. I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not asking for anything except that you know I'm sorry and I mean it in a way I couldn't have meant it 2 years ago. I hope you're building something beautiful on that ridge. I hope it looks exactly like what he dreamed. I folded the letter and set it back on the table. The afternoon sun slanted through the window, catching dust motes in golden columns. Outside, I could hear distant construction equipment from the learning center site. Closer, the wind moved through Gerald's pine with a sound like breathing. Graham's truck pulled up the gravel drive. I heard his boots on the porch, the quiet knock that meant he would come in whether I answered or not. He sat down across from me without speaking. His eyes went to the letter, then to my face, then away. He understood without asking what it was and what it meant and how heavy both those things could be. We sat in silence. Graham did not ask if I would write back because he knew some decisions could not be rushed, could not be advised, could only be weathered like winter passing into spring. Some questions were not meant to be answered quickly, or maybe at all. The construction sounds faded as the work crew finished for the day. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine resin and fresh-turned earth where the Learning Center foundation had been poured last week. I realized slowly that I did not need to decide. Not today, not next month, maybe not ever. The letter could sit unanswered, and that was an outcome I could live with. Or I could write back in 6 months or 6 years when the sharp edges of grief had worn smooth, and that was an outcome I could live with too. Some things were not about choosing the right answer. They were about learning that both answers, writing back and not writing back, forgiving and not forgiving, could be carried forward into whatever came next. That itself was a kind of peace I had not known existed until this moment sitting in a cabin rebuilt by neighbors holding the letter of a son who had poisoned his father, understanding that I did not owe anyone certainty. Graham's hand found mine across the table. Outside, the wind continued its conversation with the ridge patient, and endless. The letter stayed where it was unfolded, but unanswered. I looked at Graham. He looked back. Neither of us spoke. The silence held everything it needed to hold grief and grace, and the particular freedom that comes from learning you do not have to choose between them. For the first time in 2 years, I felt no urgency to decide what Barrett's words deserved. They could wait. I could wait. The wind and the ridge and the learning center rising from earth, Gerald had loved all of it could wait, while I learned to live with questions that had no wrong answers. That, I thought, was what peace actually looked like. Not resolution, not forgiveness granted or withheld, just the steady knowledge that both paths led somewhere I could walk. The emerald pines and late-season wildflowers framed the Gerald Mercer Community Learning Center, like the mountain itself had been waiting for this exact building all along. December, sunlight slanted through branches that had witnessed 50 years of Gerald's stewardship, and now they watched as 200 people gathered for a ribbon cutting that felt less like an ending and more like a seed finally breaking ground. I stood on the timber porch with scissors in my hand and Graham at my elbow. The piece I had found sitting at my kitchen table with an unanswered letter had carried me here. To this moment, to this mountain, to a future Gerald had trusted me to build. Iris Townsend handed me the microphone. The crowd quieted. I could see Hugh with the mining crew, all of them in clean work shirts, men and women who had found dignified employment within 10 miles of homes they no longer had to leave. Men and women who had found dignified employment within 10 miles of homes they no longer had to leave. I could see Millhaven families with children who would learn sustainable forestry in classrooms bearing my husband's name. Gerald built this mountain into a sanctuary because he believed in the people who would live near it, I said. He believed that land was not something you owned, but something you belonged to. He believed that the best legacy was not wealth passed down, but wisdom shared forward. Today we begin to honor that belief. I cut the ribbon. It fell in 2 red pieces, and the crowd erupted in applause that echoed off the mountainside. Children raced up the steps. Clara, a bright-eyed 9-year-old whose father now worked as a mining engineer, was first through the door. Her laugh rang out as she discovered the library. Iris touched my arm. "He would be so proud, Alice." Hugh joined us. 47 jobs, he said quietly. 47 families. What Gerald's death had almost destroyed his legacy had rebuilt. The mineral rights Barrett tried to steal had become employment for a community that rebuilt my home without being asked. The land Celeste saw as leverage had become a learning center that would educate Millhaven's children for generations. The fortune Barrett measured in bank accounts had transformed into something his mother's world could never calculate: sanctuary stewardship and wealth that compounds in human dignity instead of interest rates. That evening, Graham and I sat on the cabin porch wrapped in wool blankets. Stars appeared one by one above the ridge. We did not speak for a long time. The silence was comfortable, as old furniture worn smooth by years of quiet friendship. "I lost you to Gerald at a campfire once," Graham said finally, 40 years ago. "You were roasting marshmallows and he was explaining sustainable logging like poetry. I knew right then I didn't stand a chance." I laughed. "You were always better at making s'mores than declarations." "Still am," he said. His hand rested on the armrest, not reaching for mine, not pulling away. Just there, present, patient. "Are you happy, Alice?" he asked. I considered the question. Happy felt too simple. I carried grief for a husband poisoned by his own son. I carried 16 months of proving a truth I wished had never been true. I carried an unanswered letter and the knowledge that forgiveness was a choice I might never make. But I also carried a community that called me neighbor, a mountain that would feed families and teach children, a man who had waited 40 years and now sat beside me asking nothing except honest answers. "I'm at peace," I said. "I think that might actually be better." Graham's hand shifted slightly close enough that I could feel its warmth. It did not ask for anything, not forgiveness for waiting 40 years, not promises about tomorrow. It just rested there, like it had been practicing patience its entire life, and that was entirely enough. The next morning, I stood on the porch with coffee steaming in the cold air and watched dawn paint the ridge gold. Inside, Graham hummed something off-key, while making breakfast the smell of bacon drifting through the open door. You want to know the real irony? Barrett spent his whole life chasing his mother's approval and his father's money, and in the end, the woman he called worthless inherited everything that actually mattered. He thought he was disposing of me when he sent me to this cabin, thought he was isolating me from resources and relevance while he forged signatures and slowly poisoned his father. But he was actually returning me to the place where Gerald had hidden everything of value. Not just mineral rights worth $60 million, not just land that would employ 47 families, but sanctuary, community, the kind of future you cannot spend or squander because it lives in soil and classrooms, and the children who will learn that mountains are not accounts to liquidate, but legacies to protect. Sometimes the people who mean to bury you simply show you where the treasure is. I lift my coffee cup to the morning light filtering through Gerald's pines. Graham's humming continues in the kitchen, patient and steady as everything else about him. The mountain spreads before me $60 million of stone and timber, and future populated with neighbors who rebuilt my home and children who will learn in a building bearing my husband's name. Barrett called me worthless once. Standing here on this ridge with a community that calls me neighbor and a man who has been my quiet friend for 40 years, currently making breakfast in my kitchen, I think Barrett may have miscalculated. Just slightly. I smile into the steam rising from my cup and taste something I have not tasted in 2 years. Not triumph, not vindication. Something simpler and more durable. It tastes like morning coffee and pine resin and the particular grace of a life rebuilt from ashes into something better than what came before. It tastes like home. And to you listening to my story, remember this: I made the mistake of trusting without questioning. I signed papers I should have read twice. I believed tears that were never real. For months, I let grief cloud my judgment because I wanted to believe that family meant what Gerald taught me it meant. But sometimes the hardest lesson is learning that not everyone who calls you family deserves that trust. What I learned is your worth is never determined by the people who try to diminish you. Barrett called me worthless, but God's timing showed me I was standing on something far more valuable than he could see. The truth doesn't disappear just because someone buries it. It waits, and when it surfaces, it brings justice. This is what real grandma revenge looks like, not violence or pettiness, but patience, persistence, and letting the truth do its work. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever stood your ground when someone tried to silence you? Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe in stories where justice prevails, the kind of grandma revenge that comes from truth, not cruelty, please subscribe to Her Family Revenge for more stories like this one. Thank you for staying until the very end of my story. It means more than you know. Please remember, while the heart of this story is true, some details have been fictionalized for privacy and storytelling purposes. What matters most is the lesson it carries, and I hope it stays with you.